Hello, my name is Leonard Conner. This is the testimony of my life, how that God called me into the ministry to preach His Word. There was never a time in my life when I did not want to do something for God. My life was built around the fact that I wanted to do something for God. It took a long time for me to discover just what God wanted me to do. I lived in a good home, Christian parents who saw to it that I was in church every Sunday and every Wednesday night. They taught me well, though I probably didn't receive all their teachings. They taught me well. When I was real young, I used to think that I could hide behind my mother because she was bigger than I was, and the old devil couldn't see me, so he couldn't do anything to me. But I found out in a few years that that was wrong. I began to think about becoming a Christian earlier in my life, around what we used to call the junior age. The junior age in Sunday school was somewhere between 8 and 10 years old. The intermediate age started at about 10 to 13. Well, I kept thinking about just what God wanted me to do. And then one day I realized that I was lost. And that is the scaredest I've ever been in all of my life. When I realized I was lost, I knew that I couldn't save myself. I knew that from hearing the gospel preached, from reading the Word of God myself, and being in Sunday school. I knew that I could not save myself. Then it was I realized that I had to give my life to Christ in order to be saved. And that just scared me even more because I didn't know how I could do that without letting people know I was a sinner. And I hated to let people know that I was a sinner. So I put it off. I thought about it and I put it off. And then one day I realized that I couldn't put it off any longer. And then one night at the church in Rome, Texas, I remember it very, very clearly. I was holding on to the seat in front of me, and I was just rocking it. I was shaking so. And my Sunday school teacher tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Wouldn't you like to go on tonight, Leonard?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I sure would." And I went forward, and I trusted Christ, giving Him my life. And the first thing I wanted to do after that night was to follow Him in baptism and let Him know I wanted to be His child. I wanted to do what He wanted me to do. I thought probably at that point I thought that that was what God wanted me to do, was just to become a Christian and be a servant of God. And then in my intermediate years in church, something else began to tug at my heart, and I didn't really know what it was. I used to pray a lot when I was young like that, and I still do and always have. But I prayed out loud when I knew nobody couldn't hear me. So I began to pray about that. And one day I was plowing down in the field, and I noticed that the old mules kept, they acted funny. And I didn't know what it was. And then I heard this voice. I had been praying to God, and I heard this voice. And it called my name. It said, Leonard. And I thought maybe it was Daddy coming up behind me or something. And I looked around, nobody was there. And then it came again, and I looked up, and I was late in the afternoon, and the sun was just sitting right on top of the old schoolhouse where we went to school. And right above the sun, there was Jesus. As plain as I could see you sitting before me, he was there. And he told me that he wanted me to preach. He wanted me to go to the seminary. And at that point, I really didn't even know what a seminary was. But he told me that he wanted me to preach and to go to the seminary, and that really scared me then, because I didn't know how in the world I could let anybody know that God wanted me to preach, even though I had always wanted to do something for him and had gone to church all these years, and nobody had ever asked me to do anything. I wanted to, but nobody would ask me. I was shy and timid, so I let it go at that. And then when he called me to preach, I just couldn't get away from it. He just stayed right with me. And at that point, my daddy was sick and he couldn't work. And my brother was sick and he couldn't work. And I was the only person left in the family to work 150 acres of land with 6 mules. And I just felt in my heart that I couldn't let my family down by surrendering to preach and going off to school, and so I just told him that I'd rather do that than anything in the world, because he was the only one that ever asked me to do anything, and I wanted to do it. And I told him I'd rather do that than anything in the world, but right now I just didn't feel like I could, because my daddy was sick and my brother was sick, and somebody had to plow the ground and plant the seeds to make the crop, or our family would just go hungry. We wouldn't have food to eat or clothing to wear. So I told him that right now I just couldn't do it. Well, for the next 20 years, I kept telling him I didn't think I could do it. At first, I had that first excuse, and then I would have another excuse. And for almost 20 years, he would come to me in different ways. Everything I asked him for during those years, he would give to me. It didn't make any difference what it was. The prayer would be answered just immediately. And then I would forget about the problem or the need, and when I would do that, then that would kind of get the thought of preaching off my mind a little bit, and but yet it stayed right there, and he kept coming back time after time. Time after time, he kept coming back. And I got married, and I married Geneva Basham, and we had 3 daughters, and we were living in Midland, Texas, and we had lived there for several years, and I had had several different jobs. But all these years, I kept trying to do enough in the church that God wouldn't want me to preach. So I would just do more and more. I teach Sunday school 2 years to the day before I was ordained to the ministry. I was ordained as a deacon. I just tried to do everything. I would teach, I would work, I would do anything that I could do in the church. And I kept trying to do enough that he wouldn't want me to preach. And so one time we had a film in our church, and I was really desperate by this time, and had this film in our church, and it was the film Dedicated Men, and it was about men who had dedicated their lives to God and were doing things that weren't the ministry. It was just things to help churches and their own church, and just a program to help in the work of God. And I thought, boy, that's what I'm going to do. I'm gonna just go down to the bank, and I'm going to borrow me a bunch of money, and I'm going to give it to the church, and then they can do a lot of these things that they keep talking about that they would like to do. They'll be able to do those things. And the minute I said that to myself, God said to me, Leonard, I don't want anything you've got. I don't want anything you can borrow. I want you to preach. And I knew at that point that preach was what I had to do. There was no way around preaching. But I kept putting it off. And the urge kept getting stronger. And one Sunday after that, we had begun our church building program, and we were having different things to raise money. And that Sunday was a tub full on the barrelhead. That meant that we brought in an old barrel and put a tub on it, and everybody came by and put their donation in this tub. Well, I decided that, boy, I was going to give $50. And way back then, that was in the 1952, I knew then that, boy, I'm going to give $50. That's a big amount of money, and it was back then. That was a lot of money. And so I gathered up my $50, and when it came my time to go down and put my money in the tub, when I looked over into the tub to put my money into the tub, all the money that was in the tub stood up, and it was people. And they were reaching out to me. They wanted me to come and preach to them and to show them the way of Christ. And I knew then that somewhere it was just getting to where I could not hardly bear it any longer. it was getting so strong to preach. And then on 2 days before Christmas in 1952, it's on a Thursday, 3 days before Christmas, on a Thursday, I was in my little store and I was waiting on the people, and the people were all over the store there trying to buy things for Christmas and get ready for the Christmas dinner and all that. And I was working real hard, and yet my mind wasn't on what I was doing. It was on preaching, and I knew that I was going to have to preach. And I was standing at the cash register, and I heard this voice, and it said, "Leonard, I am through with you." And my knees buckled, and I fell to the floor, fell almost to the floor, holding on to the cash register and to the counter. And Mr. Williams was standing there, and he grabbed hold of me and carried me to the hospital. And I sat there in the emergency room that day with 2 doctors, and I knew that I was dying, but I could not bring myself to answer the question that I had surrendered to preach and had preached for the Lord. And therefore that was the only thing that I thought about, was preaching. I knew that my soul was saved. I knew God would take care of Geneva and the girls. I knew that. And I wasn't afraid of dying. I just didn't want to do it without preaching. And I sat there in that hospital room that day for about an hour and a half. And 2 doctors was with me, and they'd come and talk to me, and then they'd go back and they'd talk to one another, and they'd come back and talk to me, and then they'd go back and talk to one another. And all during this time, I listened to these 2 words that I was saying myself: "You haven't preached." I don't know how those words got out of me, but they were coming across. "You haven't preached. You haven't preached. You haven't preached. You haven't preached." And it was just like the pendulum of an old clock clicking as it swings back and forth. "You haven't preached. You haven't preached." I listened to that for about an hour and a half. And then I told the Lord that I knew that I had sinned against Him. I knew that I had lied to Him like a dog. I knew that I had said to Him many, many times that I would surrender to preach, and then I wouldn't surrender to preach. I knew that. And I just did everything. All these things were just going through my mind, and they were racking on my mind that I had not preached. And then I told the Lord that just this last time, if He would get me out of that place, I would surrender to preach, and I would preach for Him. And immediately I knew I wasn't going to die. I was sitting there knowing I was dying, but there wasn't anything wrong with me, but I knew I was dying. So immediately that fear of death just left me. I knew I wasn't going to die. He answered that prayer. And then it scared me again, because I knew I was going to have to then. You don't know, unless you've experienced it, how it feels to be called to preach and feel so inadequate and so unworthy to do it and so afraid you couldn't do it. You don't know how it feels unless you've been through it. But it's the worst experience a person can go through in their whole life. So I told him that I would preach for him. And immediately that left me, and I knew I wasn't going to die. And the doctor came back and he said, Leonard, he said, I want you to go home and go to bed. And I said, no, I've got to go home and go to work. And I knew then everything was fine, but he didn't. He didn't know what was going through my heart. So when I finally consented that I would go home and go to bed, I just really needed to be alone with the Lord for a while anyway. And the girl was not at home that day, and I would be there by myself, and I would go and I would just lay down, and I'd be there by myself, and I could be with the Lord, and we could talk this thing out. Come Sunday, I had to go and make that decision. This was on a Thursday, and Sunday I had to make that decision, and I knew I had to make it because I knew this was my last chance. If I didn't make it then, I'd never make it. So I decided that I would go to church and I'd make that decision. Well, instead of getting on the end of the pew like I should have, I got way over in the end. We had these little theater seats in our church, and we had a wide row in the middle and two short rows on each side, and I got on this wide row and got right out in the middle of it. Hardest place in the world to get out. And people sitting all along the seat by the side of me. And there, Brother Wood was up there preaching, and I kept looking at myself. When I saw that preaching, I looked at myself. I could just see myself. I couldn't see him. I could see me. And I kept wondering why he didn't just get down and let me up there and let me do that preaching. And then when it come time for the invitation, you don't know how scared I got, because I knew I had to make that decision. I knew they weren't going to sing but about 2 verses of the song, 3 at the most, and then they'd close that service. And if I didn't surrender to preach, then it'd be all over for me. I knew I was going to die if I didn't, because that was my last chance. There wasn't another chance for me. So I waited till I thought that would be the very last few words they were going to say in that hymn. And then I started out. And when I got started, I couldn't control myself. I was just climbing over everybody's feet and bumping them and everything else. And when I got out in the aisle, I got started down the aisle, and by the time I got to where Brother Woods was, I was running. And when I got to him, I just run right into him and grabbed hold of him, and both of us like fell down on the floor. And he asked me what was the matter with me, and I told him that I had to surrender to preach. And he said, "You got to do what?" I said, "I've got to surrender to preach." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I've never been any more sure of anything in my life than this, that I have to preach." And So he said, okay. He said, I'll tell the people. So he told the people, and that was the greatest load lifted off of me. Is even greater than the load that was lifted off of me when I was saved. And that load was lifted off of my heart, and I just felt so light, so clean, and so ready to do what God wanted me to do. And that was on Sunday night, and my first sermon was on Monday night. And then a week or so later, they had a brotherhood meeting in our association, and they asked me to be the preacher. And I preached my first sermon to a congregation of that size just about a week later. And when I got through preaching, the people came around and said, Leonard, said, where have you been preaching at? And I said, I haven't been preaching. And they said, well, you've been holding on out on us some way. Said, I never heard a man preach like that, the first sermon he ever preached. So after that, I knew I had to go to the seminary. And on April, that was on December 28th, and on 1st of April, a church in Patricia, Texas called me to be their pastor. And while I was their pastor, the Lord kept saying to me, Leonard, you've got to go to the seminary. We're not through yet. You got to go to the seminary. And but I thought, well, as long as I was preaching, that would be good enough. But the Lord just kept saying that. And during that time, I was going to sell my little store. And just as soon as I put it on the market, a man came and bought it. And I was going to go to the seminary. And then I couldn't bring myself to leave the church and go to the seminary. So wasn't long after that until the Lord took my job away from me. And everywhere I looked, I couldn't find a job. There just was not a job anywhere. And it was 65 miles to that little church that called me, and I had to go back and forth. And so I just didn't know what I was going to do. I couldn't buy gasoline to go. So it got so bad that Geneva had started taking in ironing. She did ironing for a little laundry cleaning thing there pretty close to our church. And so she did ironing for them and to buy our groceries and things and help us get by and help us have gasoline. And about that time, here comes the church revival. Well, I didn't see how in the world I was going to have gasoline to go back and forth. So I'd go out and pick up soda pop bottles and take them to the filling station and give them to the filling station and put that much gas in my car. Ever how many bottles I could find, and I'd put that much gas in my car. And then one night at the church, there was Geneva had to stay at home and iron. She couldn't go. And this man at church said that he knew that I was having it pretty rough right now, and he wanted to give me $2. So he gave me $2, and I tried to get him not to. Then my brother-in-law told me, said, Leonard, said, I know that that's hard on you, and you got to have gasoline, you don't have a job. So he gave me $3 to buy, and I used all that to buy gasoline with to get back and forth over to the church and for the revival. And Then one night I went across the street to this filling station, and the man never came to church. The whole time I was there, he never came to church. I drove up to the station, and he said to get the girls a drink, and he said to me, he said, pull your car up a little further. And I said, oh, all we want to do is just for the girls to get a drink of water before we leave to go home. And he said, I said, pull the car up a little further. So I pulled the car up a little further, and he filled it full of gasoline. And I just couldn't believe that. And so before the week was out, going 65 miles one way, that was all gone. And this woman, she was a Methodist woman, but she liked to hear me preach, so she always came to our church instead of going to the Methodist church, so she could hear me preach. And she told me she didn't want me to buy any gasoline because she wanted to give me a full tank of gas. So we was going to eat lunch at her house that day, and we drove up there, and just before I got to the house, I ran out of gas. Just embarrassed me to death, and my deacons were there, and all of them, and they got to teasing me. And I told them, I said, now you just tease me all you want to. But I said, I forget her name right this minute, but she told me she wanted to give me a full tank of gas, and I said, that's exactly what I've got it prepared for. So you just don't say anything else about it. And so we went out, and her husband went out to the tank, and we pulled up there, and when it got about half full, I tried to get him to stop, and he wouldn't. He just ran it over with gasoline. And then they had been to Mexico on a trip, and he had a $20 traveler's check, and he said, I don't know of anything I'd rather do with this than to give it to you two preachers, me and the evangelist. And so he signed it and gave it to the evangelist, and he took care of it. And then at the end of the revival, the evangelist told the people that I was really having a rough time right now without a job and everything, and he didn't know anything he'd rather do with that $10. He told them about that $10 and said he didn't know anything he'd rather do with his $10 than to give it to me because I needed it. And so he told the man there at the store, there at the church, to stand at the door and hold his hat, and if people wanted to give something to me, to do it. And they took up $65 that night. Well, that was a lot of money back then. But I knew then I had to go to seminary. I knew I had to, as much as I loved those people, as much as they loved me, I knew I had to leave and go to the seminary. So the following Sunday night, I preached my last sermon, and we got in the car and drove to Fort Worth and got there just as the sun came up. And I tried to find a job, couldn't find a job. I went to, I know this is getting a little bit long and maybe you're tired of it, but to make a long story short, I went to this company and they told me to go all over town and look for a job, and if they couldn't, come back because they didn't have anything for me right then. And I did, and then couldn't find anything, so I went back and told him, and he picked up the telephone and called this one man up and asked him he talked to him about the people that was working there. He said, no, this man's got to have more hours than that. It said transfer so-and-so over to such and such store because I want this man to be in that one store. I don't know why. I have no idea why he wanted me to be in that one store, but he did. And so he sent this other man to another store. And then we moved to Fort Worth. We lived in Midland, and we moved to Fort Worth. And I was trying to find a truck or a trailer or something so I could go get my furniture. And this man heard me talking, and he said, if you'll give me $30, I'll go get it and bring it to Fort Worth. And it was 300 miles one way. For $30, he took my car, took his truck, went to Midland, and brought my furniture to Fort Worth. A little bit later than that, about a year after I got started school and everything, had gotten a job, I went home one day and Geneva told me, said, Leonard said, did you know we haven't been eating? And I said, well, we've had 3 meals a day ever since we've been here, and I haven't missed a meal. I thought I'd been eating. She said, we haven't. She said, I figured it up, and we didn't have any money for groceries. And she had taken every penny that I made, every penny that we had gotten, and added it all up, and then added up the actual expenses of rent and car payments, things like that we had to have. She added all those things up and didn't add any groceries in, and it came out exactly to the penny the amount of money that we had received, and there was nothing left for groceries. And yet we had eaten 3 meals a day and had not missed any meals. Well, God had showed me then that He would do what He said He would do. He'd take care of me. The Scripture tells us that He'll take care of us. And I knew then that I didn't have any worry. I just felt like that if I surrendered to preach, that we'd starve to death, because I knew I could never have a big church. And my prayer to God was that if He just had anything left that I could do, if He'd get me out of that place, I'd do it. So every church that I pastored had special problems, they had special needs. And through my service, He was able to establish those churches, and those churches are doing well 32 years later. So if God wants you to preach, or if God's calling you for anything, if God is wanting you to do anything for Him, He'll get you one way or the other, or He'll kill you. If you don't surrender, He'll kill you. I know that from my own experience. Now, He might not kill you, but He would have killed me. And I'm not trying to scare you into surrendering to God to do anything. I just know that one way or other, if He wants you to do something, He'll get you. My advice to you is, don't do like I did. Don't wait 20 years. Surrender to the Lord. Surrender to Him. Give your life to Him. He'll take care of you. He's going to take care of your needs. He's shown me that all these years. I was in the ministry 32 years. And every day He showed me that He would take care of me. And even yet today, after being retired for 7 years, He is still showing me every day that He's going to take care of me and my needs. And He has. And we've never had anything extra. We don't have anything extra. But we have our needs. And God only said that He would supply our needs. And if you have anything above your needs, it's just the overflow of His grace and His love and His willingness to give to you. But if He wants you to preach, if He wants you to do anything, don't do like I did. Don't go through the misery that I went through. Do it. He'll honor you with His love and with His presence if you'll honor Him with your service.